began his career in finance at Goldman Sachs and Company in New York in 1966. He served as vice chairman and co-chief operating officer from 1987 to 1990, and as co-senior partner and co-chairman from 1990 to 1992. Before joining Goldman, he was an attorney at the firm Cleary, Gottlieb, Steen, and Hamilton in New York City from 1964 to 1966. Long active in public affairs, Mr. Rubin joined the Clinton administration in 1993 as assistant to the president for economic policy and as director of the newly created National Economic Council. At the NEC, he coordinated economic policy recommendations to the president, and he monitored the implementation of the president's economic policy goals. In January of 1995, Mr. Rubin was appointed as our nation's 70th Secretary of the Treasury. He served for 4.5 years, from 1995 until July of 1999, where he was involved in balancing the federal budget, opening trade policy to further globalization, acting to stem the financial crises in Mexico, Asia, and Russia, helping to resolve the impasse over the public debt limit, and guiding reforms at both the Internal Revenue Service and in the financial services industry. From 1999 to 2009, Mr. Rubin served as a member of the board of directors at Citigroup and as a senior advisor to the company. In that capacity, he worked extensively with the firm's clients around the world. Mr. Rubin is one of the founders of the Hamilton Project, an economic policy project that is housed at the Brookings Institution, and it offers a strategic vision and innovative policy proposals for how to create a growing economy that benefits more Americans. Mr. Rubin has also written a book. He co-authored with Jacob Weisberg, In an Uncertain World, Tough Choices from Wall Street to Washington, published by Random House in 2003. It was a New York Times bestseller, and it was also named one of Business Week's 10 best business books of that year. In June of 2017, Mr. Rubin concluded his 10-year term as co-chairman of the Council on Foreign Relations, but he currently serves as co-chairman emeritus. He is a member of the boards of trustees at Mount Sinai Health System, chairman of the board of the Local Initiatives Support Corporation. In June of 2014, he completed a 12-year term as a member of the Harvard Corporation and is now a member of its Finance Committee. Mr. Rubin joined Centerview Partners in 2010 as a senior counselor of the firm. In this role, he serves as a sounding board and advisor to clients across the firm's various activities. Mr. Rubin received his undergraduate degree in economics from Harvard University and a law degree from Yale. He is, of course, the recipient of many honorary degrees, and we are so pleased to have him here today. So please join me in welcoming the Honorable Robert E. Rubin. There's some water under here.
You can watch.
You want my phone? I can bring up my phone for you.
No, just a watch. I don't have a watch, so I'm trying to negotiate the borrowing of a watch. Can I borrow yours, Paul? You want collateral?
Is yours easier to see than mine?
No,
Mine
this is good.
okay.
No, there's cheaper. Yeah, okay. Okay. You know, just before I begin my remarks, I listened to what you had to say that I did at Treasury. I think if President Clinton were here, he would be inclined to say that maybe he did all that, and we all worked with him, but be that as it may. You know, it's nice to be here. I mentioned to your president, I've not been here before, but just arriving on the campus and walking around a little bit, which I did before I got here, it's a very nice feel. It really is. You get a feeling of a nice place and a place that's serious and at the same time committed to doing good things. So I thank you for inviting me, and I'm delighted to be here. What I'm going to do today, by the way, I have a heck of an idea, Paul, seriously, for your next year's speaker, if you'd like. Yeah. Yeah, I really do. I'd have to persuade him to do it, but I think he would. Okay. And maybe he wouldn't. Okay, we'll find out. But he might. What I'm going to do today is to discuss the longer-term outlook for the U.S. economy. And I'll do that from a perspective that reflects what I do these days. I'm an investor, I'm an advisor to some investment funds, and I've remained very active, for better or worse, in the national policy dialogue. And I think the longer term perspective as it relates to our economy is really what we should focus on. For those of you who are students, that's the world you're going to live in. For those of you who are investors, you're involved in business, I at least think that one's focus ought to be exactly that, the longer term, not the shorter term prospects for our economy. Let me start by, I spoke in Beijing about a month ago at the China Development Forum, which is their large annual policy conference. But what I said now, roughly speaking, is what I said there about the U.S. economy. And that is that I think we have enormous strengths, long-term strengths. We have a dynamic society, we have flexible labor and capital markets, we have a deeply embedded rule of law, now being slightly challenged perhaps, but anyway, a deeply embedded rule of law, we have vast natural resources, and we have better demographics than China or the EU. And there is much else. I would rather be engaged in economic activity in the United States than any other country. Having said all that, if we're going to realize the potential that that creates, what we have got to do is to meet hugely consequential economic policy challenges. And that we have not done, at least in the great preponderance of challenges, we have not met for really close to 20 years now. And that, in my judgment, is the absolute key to the future of our economy and our society for all of us. That is to say, will we or will we not reestablish effective government? In order for our political system to function effectively, it seems to me there are three requisites. Number one, there has to be a willingness of elected leaders to engage in principled compromise, something which we have in almost total measure lost in our system today. Political leaders or elected leaders have to be willing to make difficult decisions about long-term issues where the benefits are long-term, the costs are short-term. And there has to be a willingness to ground decisions in facts and analysis, approach with intellectual integrity, though obviously politics will always be involved. In 1997, President Clinton worked with Republican Majority Leader Trent Lott, and what they did was to pass a 1997 balanced budget agreement that dealt with our deficit. It had significant public investment, significant national security measures, and a great deal else that mattered to our country. I was in the Oval Office during the final negotiation, and we said to President Clinton, don't relinquish, don't bend on these following items. And he relinquished on most of them. But that was okay, because in turn, Trent Lott also relinquished on some of his items. And so what you got was a piece of legislation that had pieces in it that each of them didn't like, but that overall and on balance was something they both liked, substantively and politically. That legislation could not pass today because of the unwillingness to engage in principled compromise. There are many views as to how our system got into this state. I'm not going to get into this right now. Let me just mention a few. I think bad behavior led to bad behavior over some decades. I think that social media, which has so much promise, nevertheless has become, and we all know this, has become an echo chamber for ideology, partisanship, and ad hominem attack. I think that there has been a loss of a willingness amongst our population to respond in a serious way to the politics of difficult issues. Campaign finance has simply gotten out of control. Some of you are probably familiar with the Citizens United decision, which basically opened up the floodgates for the use of individual money. And there's a great deal else. Underlying all that, though, I think something far more fundamental has happened. And that is an ongoing vicious cycle at the intersection of economics, politics, and cultural change. And that vicious cycle, in my judgment, is the fundamental that is undermining our political system. Let me expand on that for a moment. As we all know, we are in a period of tectonic change economically, driven by globalization to some extent, but largely by technological development. And these forces provide great opportunities for productivity, for growth, and for broad-based economic well-being. But they've also put tremendous pressure on wages, on job security, and have tended to increase inequality. The many people that have been adversely affected by these pressures, and if you look at most studies of American population today, they'll show that probably something over 50% of our people are struggling in one way or another economically. The many people who have been subject to these pressures, in large measure because the government simply has failed to do what it needed to do, have in large measure lost confidence that government will meet their needs. That loss of confidence, in turn, has fueled a loss of support for sound policy and greatly increased support for populism, for nationalism, and for bumper sticker proposals on the left and on the right. The result has been that elected leaders have too often abandoned, and I would say predominantly at this point, abandoned the politically difficult path of sound policy, and instead have supported measures that have popular appeal, but that are unlikely to work for the purposes for which they were allegedly designed, that are highly likely politically undoable, and that as a consequence distract attention and effort from measures that could work and would work and are the areas in which our country needs to move forward. Furthermore, all of this is exacerbated by the fear that many elected officials have today that if they reject partisanship and ideology for reason and for compromise, they will be challenged and defeated in primaries. I have spoken to a goodly number of people in elected office who will tell me, I think we probably should do this, but I'm going to support that, because if I don't, I face the risk of a primary, either from my right if I'm a Republican or from a left if I'm a Democrat. And that is obviously toxic for our political system. Another powerful factor, at least in my view, that's been driving populism and nationalism has been an increasing sense of cultural dislocation amongst the many who feel left behind by a changing economy, and a phenomenon that involves race, it involves immigration, it involves the rise of the coasts versus the rest of the country, the increasing advantages of the well-educated versus the less educated, and much else. This is obviously a very complex issue, but I believe, and we began to face this when I was there and President Clinton, but it's vastly increased since then. I believe that that complex issue could be addressed if we had a policy agenda that promoted strong growth and inclusive strong growth, in other words, widespread economic well-being. Government's failure to address the pressures that I've just described and the resulting job dislocation, wage pressures, and increasing inequality have had another effect, and that is an increasing loss of confidence in our market-based economic system, that is to say in capitalism. And you see this in the papers now every day. And that's particularly true amongst younger people. The problem, though, in my view, is not our market-based system. All of modern economic history, and some of you major in economics, you probably know more about this than I do, but all of modern economic history suggests that market-based economics is not only the best path to economic success, but probably the only one that will work on a consistent basis. There is no successful economy in the world today that is not committed to market-based economics. India and China only started growing in a meaningful way when they committed to market-based economics. The Chinese government in the third plenum in 2013 restated that commitment to market-based economics, and the premier and the president both recently restated that commitment. Now, having said that, the realities on the ground in China are somewhat more complex, but nevertheless, it's operating within the context, at least, of that commitment to market-based economics. The problem, I think, is that markets by their nature will not address many issues that are critically important to our people. The ones I've mentioned already: wage pressure, job dislocation, increasing inequality, social safety net, environmental protection, health care, and in addition, the core underpinnings, if you will, of a market-based economy: education, basic research, and so forth. Thus, to get back to something I said a few moments ago, I believe that our economic future, and for that matter, the future of our society, depends on whether we break that vicious cycle and reestablish effective and constructive government or not. If we do, I think with our strengths, we can be extraordinarily successful, both as to growth and as to widespread economic well-being. If we don't, then I think we will likely erode economically, we will run greater risk of periodic crisis, and we will have increasing social tension. As for the likelihood that we'll reestablish effective government, many of the people I know who are involved in the political system, as elected officials or journalists, whatever, are deeply, deeply concerned, particularly when you look at the empirical evidence of the last, say, 15 to 20 years. I am also concerned, but I have a more affirmative view as to the probabilities. I think the odds are probably pretty good, maybe even very good, that at some point our system will begin working again, though the timing obviously is unpredictable, and I could be wrong. We have a history of political resilience, sometimes in very difficult circumstances. We have a dynamic society, and politics can change very, very quickly in America. Let me get a little more specific about some of the kinds of things that could happen, at least in my view, could get us back on track. Leaders may emerge, and this can happen very quickly, who are committed to intellectual integrity, who are committed to governing, and who can make that politically resonant. It only works if it's politically resonant, but who can make that politically resonant. I think, and I keep hoping this will happen, though it hasn't yet, that concerned citizens, some number of concerned citizens with the financial resources will come along and take social media and develop programs for engaging, not informing, but engaging the American people broadly with the issues so that we have a better informed electorate. External pressure could certainly have an effect, geopolitical matters, economic matters, etc. There are states and localities that are acting in important and useful and constructive ways. Maybe that will affect the federal system. And finally, I know serious people, and I don't know what I think about this exactly, but I know serious people who think there may be some material changes in our party structure. And there are all kinds of possibilities one can imagine in that respect. Let me just make so I digress for 1 second. It does strike me that all of us can get involved in the effort to try to promote effective government. If you're students, you can do what I did and work on campaigns with ringing doorbells or whatever, filling envelopes, or I don't know, in the many other ways that one can do this. And all the rest of us can take advantage of every opportunity we have in this democratic society to participate in the political system. And whatever your views may be, whether you're conservative, you're liberal, whatever else, one thing you can do, and I actually do try to do this, is to urge the candidates you support to commit themselves to engaging in making our system work, and to commit to engaging in principal compromise. How much effect that has, I have no idea. But I think if enough people do it, it can begin to have some effect. More broadly, I think the key to breaking that vicious cycle that I described before, the vicious cycle of worsening conditions, loss of confidence in the political system, and back and forth, the key is that whatever political conditions allow, whenever you get a window, to begin putting in place an inclusive growth policy agenda that drives strong growth and widespread economic well-being. And these two objectives are interdependent. I do not believe we will have strong growth unless we have widespread economic well-being, and you're certainly not going to have widespread economic well-being without strong growth. Far-reaching proposals have been put forward on a lot of issues, but in many cases, I think probably in most cases actually, these proposals with varying degrees of detail and specificity, while they have a constructive aspect to them, which is they focus, and I'll give you one example in a moment, focus attention on real and serious issues, but too often they are more slogans than they are policies. They're easy to put on a bumper sticker, but they don't provide the kind of substantive content that they would need to realize either the objectives of the proposal themselves or to further our economic well-being. Let me give you one example. I think this Green New Deal has had a tremendously positive effect in focusing attention on climate change, which I personally believe is an existential problem of our age. However, it is not a practical program to move forward. And in some sense, it has distracted attention away from what we desperately need to do if our society, and for that matter our global community, is going to survive. And as the attention is focused on the Green New Deal itself, as a politically contentious issue, in some ways it's taken attention away from the focus that we need to have, which is what are actual practical, substantively practical and politically doable measures that can be taken to deal with this existential problem. So I think it's been I think Green New Deal served a very useful purpose in focusing on the attention on the issue, but I think it's distracted from the attention that we need to have on the kinds of measures that could actually make progress on this critical issue. If we had a political system now, and this is at least how I think we should do it. This is what I did when I was there. This is how we approached dealing with policy, and it's how I think that should be dealt with. Policy should be dealt with. What you need to do, at least in my view, you've got to decide what your objectives are. Then you can decide what are the issues that you need to address pursuant to that objective. And then you got to decide what effects, if you take the measures that you are considering, what effects they will have, and what are the probabilities of these various kinds of effects, including unintended consequences. And if you do all that, and you base all this on facts and analysis, approach with intellectual integrity, but always with a lot of sensitivity to the politics, you should come up with an effective policy regime that meets our people's needs. But as President Clinton used to say, all the good policy thinking in the world won't matter if the politics doesn't work, because the policy won't be implemented. And his view had always been, and I think absolutely rightly so, that a successful policy regime must wed the substance, which I've just mentioned, with a political strategy that is effective and gives your substance political viability. I remember being in the Oval Office with him in 1994, and I don't know if you all remember, some of you will remember 1994 maybe. We got killed in the midterms. It was horrendous. And he was deeply frustrated because he had put in place an economic policy agenda that was complex and dealt with the complexity of the issues we faced. And I was there in the Oval Office, and he said to me, he said, these issues are complex, and what the American people want is they want John Wayne to ride up on a white horse and fire a silver bullet. There's a slight mixing of cowboy metaphors, but leaving that, yeah, well, look, I actually made that observation to him at the time. He said I also didn't know very much about a lot of things, so that was okay. But in any event, there is a mixing of cowboy metaphors, but leaving that aside, his point was right. It is very easy to promote bumper sticker proposals, and it's very hard to get effective politics around complex responses to complex problems. Edward R. Murrow, who, as all of you know, is one of the nation's historic figures in journalism, died long ago, once said, our major obligation is not to mistake slogans for solutions, and I think that's right. The inclusive policy agenda, or inclusive growth policy agenda I mentioned before, would have many dimensions. I'm not going to get into that right now, but just let me briefly mention a few. We obviously need to have a broad human capital agenda with education, with subsidized lifelong learning, subsidized apprenticeships, enormous amount else. We need targeted public employment, in my opinion, that produces useful output, but also gives disadvantaged people soft and hard skills to be successful in the mainstream economy. We need to address poverty. We need to address criminal justice reform. We need to have, at least in my view, universal health care, and also bend the cost curve on health care, because our cost curve is unsustainably high. We need sensible immigration policy that gives us the inflow of immigrants, high and low skill, that our country so badly needs. At the same time, gives us strong border protection. We need to deal with the DACA issue in that respect in some sensible way. We need a sensible cost-benefit framework for regulation, and there's a great deal else. There's a critically important issue I discussed recently with a New York Times reporter. He said to me, corporate America is doing well, but it's not flowing down to workers, and what do we do about that? It's a complicated problem, and it's one that deserves a great deal of attention. But at least a few thoughts are that we use monetary and fiscal policy to maintain tight labor markets, thereby helping wages. Now, the problem there is you don't want to go too far. A lot of people these days are disregarding our fiscal condition, which I think has the potential, at least, for being quite troubling. But using monetary and fiscal policy in a sensible way to maintain tight labor markets. Another is to have labor market regulations that give workers a fair opportunity to support collective bargaining. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the Earned Income Tax Credit, but it's a very good program to supplement incomes, and that could be expanded in many ways to help people who are actively working but are subject to the wage pressures that I described before. There's also the growing problem, or growing issue, I suppose, of the gig economy, where people are working as independent contractors in form, although in fact they're just the same as full-time employees, but what they don't have is benefits. And we need a policy response to that that enables those people to have the same kind of benefits as people who are full-time employees. There's a lot more I could discuss on this, but let me just mention two issues. One is climate change. I do believe climate change will destroy life on Earth as we know it if we don't deal with it. Virtually all economists have the view that the most effective way, and maybe in some ways the only effective way, or the only practical effective way to address climate change is through a price on carbon. That is highly unpopular politically, but sooner or later, if we don't do it, and if we don't face that political difficulty effectively, we will pay a catastrophic price, in my opinion. We also should support research in all sorts of ways, including the sort of the holy grail, if you will, which would be the technologies that can take the carbon out of the atmosphere, but in large scale. But we have no such we have technologies that some people think might be promising someday, but we certainly don't have it now. Hank Paulson, former Secretary of Treasury, also likes to point out that the effects of climate change are happening much more rapidly than have been predicted. And since that's happened so far, I guess one could make a pretty good case that it's likely to continue in the future. The second issue I'll mention is the one I alluded to a moment ago. That is our ever-worsening future debt position. There's a lot of debate today. Should we worry about our fiscal position or not? Should we pay for the measures we want to take or not? I think that ultimately we will pay a very large price if we have a fiscal policy that is not in sync with underlying fundamentals. And I think we're heading in that direction now. Whether the timing on that is and how much longer we can continue to do this, I don't know. But in any event, it seems to me that the requisite with respect to fiscal policy is in the revenue area. Revenues as a percentage of GDP, or percentage of our economy, are currently 16.5%. When we left office in the Clinton years, and they were excellent, well, exceedingly strong economic conditions, revenues were 20% of GDP. The average over some relatively long period of time for revenues as a percentage of GDP in a full employment economy is about 18.5%, something like that. So we have a lot of room on the upside to increase revenues without, I think, adversely affecting our economy, assuming we do it in a sensible way, and I think we need to do it. But there certainly is no very popular, there's not a lot of political support for that right now, at least not to do it in sensible ways. But there's a lot we could do that I think is base broadening and a whole bunch of other ways of doing this that I think would have relatively limited, if any, adverse economic effect, and would be very important economically to help improve our fiscal position and pay for new measures. Let me turn now from the key to our future, which is getting our own house in order, to just a few very brief comments on China, because I really do think that what happens in China and our relationship with China are going to be enormously important to what happens in this country. As I mentioned a moment ago, I spoke at this China Development Forum conference in Beijing, give or take a month ago. And I had the same impression there as I've had over the years. I visited China or talked to people here who know about China. And that is, I'm no expert in China, but I have had a lot of exposure to people who are. And China has enormous strengths, we all know that. But they also face significant, hugely significant, I think, longer-term issues. And I think the significance of those issues are underestimated by a lot of analysts in this country as they look at China. Interestingly, at least interesting to me, when I was in China and I met with some people I know, Chinese business and political people, I think there is a recognition of these issues. I think the place where they're under-recognized is here. So, China, like the United States, ironically, though it has a very different political system, basically its future depends on whether or not its political system, though very different than ours, rises to meet the challenges, the policy challenges that they face. I do have the view, my view, is that the United States and China are both likely, probably highly likely, to succeed over time, but that is predicated on the notion that both of our political systems will do what is needed to be done. I also think that we could each benefit from the other one being successful, as long as it happens in the context of a constructive relationship, not an adversarial relationship. That mutually constructive, that mutually beneficial relationship would involve trade and investment where we can both benefit, but it's imperative for dealing with climate change, terrorism, what scares me greatly, which is the terrorist use of weapons of mass destruction, including getting hold of nuclear materials, chemical weapons, biological weapons. These are issues that can be enormously destructive to both our countries, and no country is strong enough to deal with this all by itself. But if you take the two largest economies in the world, I think that is the way to try to work on those issues. The most immediate source of stress in our relationship is obviously the trade situation. That's very complex. But the bottom line of it is there is in some fair measure, state-directed economy in China, and those policy measures intersect with trade, and that's where we have the problem. The other part of the problem is that we approach this in what I think was a non-optimal way, to put it mildly, by going with tariffs first, unilaterally and very publicly, instead of working with the EU, Brazil, Mexico, and others quietly and working something out where tariffs are the last resort, not the first resort. In any event, it does seem to me, and people who know much more than I have the same view, that we should be able to find some kind of reasonable way to work our way through that. And hopefully that'll happen sooner rather than later, and hopefully it won't just be cosmetic. Each of our countries has to recognize that the other may not behave in the constructive way that we would like, and that does require contingency planning. But I think what one needs to do is make sure that contingency planning doesn't interfere with the effort to have a constructive relationship. The only other comment I'll make on China is, while there are a lot of uncertainties about our relationship with China, though I certainly hope that it will get on the path that it needs to be on, though it's not at the present time, what I think is certain is that the 21st century is going to look very different depending on whether the United States and China figure out a way to work constructively with each other or we have a confrontational relationship. I believe that the path of our two countries and the path of the relationship between them is going to have a substantial and maybe even enormous effect on all of our lives in the years to come. Let me close with just one more comment. As I've already indicated, I think, despite all the uncertainties, that the United States is well positioned to succeed going forward, though that does depend, as I've now said multiple times, on getting our political house in order. And it seems to me that get our house in better order than I did with that bottle of water. In any event, we dropped the ball in our political system. In any event, in that context, it seems to me that a purpose that should unite all of us, no matter what our views may be, the conservatives, the liberals, and all the things in between, we should all be united around this idea of trying to do everything we can to get our political system to work again. And that is going to be the absolute key to whether or not we succeed. Thank you all very much. Thank you. All right. Restored my water. That's a little easier than restoring the political system, but anyway.
All right.
I wonder what would have happened if the bottle had been opened before I spilled it.
Oh, no. Then it would have been quite a disaster. But it would have made your analogy even better.
It would have made my analogy. That's very good. It would have made my analogy better. Okay.
So by tradition, we always give the students first crack at everything until they're exhausted. And then if there's any time remaining, then we go for everybody else. Because the students are our primary focus here.
I agree.
So students, please raise your hand and I will hand you the microphone. Stand up.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. First thing to say, the opening of your speech where you talked about this country being captured, you talked about partisanship and you talked about populism. But unfortunately, I think one thing that was left out, Mr. Speaker, was the capture of our economic status. The fact that we have an economic class that has held power and shaped legislation to benefit them in their own private industries, when they re-enter the workforce, this is commonly referred to as regulatory capture or the revolving door. One thing that is common amongst Republican and Democrats is that every single time an administration the banker happens to be from Goldman Sachs. The fact is, Mr. Speaker, when you talk about the fact that our country can't get together, the economic class seems to have it together. And this has led to a few issues, and I promise I'll give you time to respond, sir. It won't take too long.
This seems a little more like a speech than
Mr. Speaker, when you open up with President Clinton leading the Treasury, the fact is if Mr. Clinton did lead the Treasury, derivatives would have been regulated. That's a decision you made, sir. The fact is, Mr. Speaker, that your friend, John Corzine, used the position of private benefactor with MF Global to lobby the Security Exchange Commission to not allow the Financial Industry Regulatory Agency to investigate the fact that his company, post him going into the private sector, was over-leveraging debt in countries like Italy and Spain. The third thing to say, Mr. Speaker...
I'll make the observation. Wait, no, you just that...
I understand, Mr. Speaker. I will get there in a second. But the third thing to say is you talk about populism resurging, but the Tea Party emerged as a result of the '08 crisis. The fact is you benefit, even though you repealed the Glass-Steagall Act, which led to the '08 crisis, you benefit from speaker fees that come to you.
May I make a suggestion? Let me respond to a few pieces of this. First place, Glass-Steagall didn't lead to the '08 crisis, I promise you. If you speak to the senior banking lawyers in New York, what they will tell you is that the Glass-Steagall had been interpreted by the Federal Reserve Board to the point where the major banks could do anything they wanted to do at the time that it had been repealed. So whether or not repealed, they could have done everything they did do. But let me make a broader comment.
I will finish my question in just a second. I
think you did finish.
Swear to you, sir. Well, just to say that the UK Special Independent Commission disagrees with you because removing the retail side of banking from the lending aspect actually secures stability in banking and loaning industries, something the UK Commission gave in 2011. But I guess my question is, would the solution to all your problems not to give neoliberal economists like you a platform in here that reaffirm your economic calculus that has not had merit in the history of our decisions and have actually hampered our economic policy and led to individuals not feeling as if the economic class represents them anymore?
I think my brief answer to that question would be no. No, look, these economic issues are very complex. They really and truly are. I think it's easy to brush aside conventional analytic thinking about economic issues, but unfortunately they're kind of grounded in reality, at least in my opinion. And I think our problem doesn't lie where you think it lies. I think that what you call a revolving door, which we're about the only country that has it to the extent we do, I think it's been very constructive. We get people in government who understand the business and economic world, and we get people in the economic and business world who understand government. No, I think our problem is different. I think there's the problem that I outlined. I think we simply have had an unwillingness in our political system to deal with very difficult issues for which there are, I think, at least good answers, but which have been a victim of the vicious cycle that I've just addressed. I don't know if that addresses your comment. By the way, derivatives did not, I don't think derivatives played any role whatsoever in the '08 crisis. And the response to the '08 crisis is an example. The '08 crisis was an extraordinary event. I mean, it was, the Federal Reserve Board didn't see it, the great endowment, I was very involved with Harvard Corporation. The great endowments didn't see it, the pension, virtually nobody. A lot of people saw excesses. I saw them, I used to speak about them. What virtually nobody saw was the potential for them all to come together in the kind of crisis we had. And that was one instance where our political system actually worked reasonably well in response to it with the stimulus, and arguably could have been larger, but nevertheless with stimulus, with TARP and the rest.
Okay, another question from a student?
So you mentioned complex solutions to complex problems, and I believe those complex solutions require meaningful conversation, and those conversations have to include dissent in order to fully come to
I'm sorry, include what?
Have to include dissent and
I agree.
pushback. So, and often I think that dissent is tagged as distracting or radical, and you mentioned the Green New Deal and how the Green New Deal does not account for economic reparations for those who have been disproportionately affected by climate change, but often that type of dissent is seen as distracting and radical. So my question is, how do we come to those complex solutions when the American society does not value dissent and we tag that dissent as radical and distracting?
Oh, I totally agree with you. I think dissent is critical to making good decisions. In 1992, after Governor Clinton was elected president, we all met with him in Little Rock. And what he said was that if you all disagree with me, and you don't tell me what you think, I'll be dead. And when we were at Treasury, the thing that we did was to get everybody together, and we would say, okay, this is what we're thinking of, but what do you think of in response? Now, my point in the Green New Deal was different. My point in the Green New Deal was, I think aspirationally it's terrific, but if you look at it, it does two things I think are a problem. One is it takes a whole bunch of issues and put them into one. Every one of those issues is massively complicated substantively, politically. You will never, ever, even in the most, whatever your legislation may look like, you will never get action on them all put together. What you've got to do is segregate them out, and then you've got to deal with them one at a time. I think that although all of those issues are very important, that climate change really will destroy life on Earth as we know it. And so I think you've got to decide, or what can you do that's constructive on climate change? The Green New Deal doesn't give you a constructive path forward. And if you speak to economists, what they will say, who know this field, they will say probably, not probably, almost surely, the most important and even maybe the only meaningful thing we can do. There's a lot we can do, but the most meaningful we can do is what I said before, which is an energy tax. Unfortunately, that is a very difficult thing to accomplish. And then you support technological research and whatever else. But I agree with you. I think there are a whole host of issues. And what the Green New Deal was to sort of just lump them all together and sort of in some aspirational sense say, we need to address all these. I think we do need to address all these. But I think we've got to do it in some practical way, practical substantively and practically politically, or we'll never get anything done. Is that responsive to your question?
Yeah, please speak a little bit to how, so I think in this current day that we're sitting in, we're trying to figure out which fire to put out first. Do we put out the fire of climate change or the fire of poverty or the fire of people without jobs?
Yep.
And I think the Green New Deal is not perfect, but it solves, at least attempts to solve all those issues. So how do we get started solving issues?
Yeah, well, that's a good question. It doesn't really solve any issues. It just says we need to solve these issues. And I think what we have to hope, and I said in my remarks actually, I think everything you said is correct. I think we need to I think we need to address all those problems. And if we have a window, if there's some point at which our political system begins to function effectively, then I think what you do is you try to do as much as you can to put in place an inclusive growth policy agenda that promotes strong growth and addresses the multiple issues that you raised, plus plenty others that we need to address. Having said that, even under the best of circumstances, our political system is only going to take so much load at any one time. And yeah, I would pick, if it were me, I would pick climate change just because I do think it is existentially dangerous. And I think that a lot we can do to help the people who are being left behind and who are not benefiting from the strength of our economic conditions. And those are the two things I would focus on. And then I listed some of the particulars I would do.
We only have time for one final question. Is there a student? One last question? Oh, in the back.
Test this real quick? Cool. In your talks, you mentioned how money and politics. Is this actually better? Okay. It's a little bit harder for me to. In your talk, you mentioned how money and politics is influencing policy and corrupting our system and disempowering voter confidence. Right now,
I didn't say corrupting our system. You said corrupting our system. But I said it is having an undue effect on our system, right?
Okay, I'm going to say corrupting our system in that case then.
Okay, well, I'm going to say unduly affecting our system. So we'll characterize it different ways. Go ahead.
Absolutely. I think that's going to be true for most cases.
That's what?
The common voter has to trust the financial experts to lead the way and government institutions to regulate those financial industries, not the other way around. In 1998, you argued to remove CFTC oversight as a regulating body, opposed CDOs as regulations, which were the majority of Goldman Sachs profits at the time. So regardless of whether or not you want to take responsibility, oppose CDOs.
Oppose what?
CDOs, collateralized debt obligations. I'm sure most of us are probably somewhat aware of what those are.
Yeah, in 1998, I'm not sure there were any CDOs, were there?
That was two separate instances, sir. So in 1998, you did that, and then as your time is...
No, in 1998...
You argued to remove CFTC oversight.
Just to be factually kind of correct.
Mitigatory.
In 1998, there was a proposal to regulate...
So in 1998, you argued to remove CFTC oversight as a regulating body. Okay, I will power through if that's all right with you.
Well, but just for the fun of it, let me finish. No, there was an issue around regulation of derivatives. It was a very complex issue. And had the CFTC done what they wanted to do, it could possibly have invalidated all pre-existing derivatives contracts, which would create absolute chaos. Wait a minute, let me finish, just for the fun of it, let me finish. When I wrote my book, which came out in 2003, which, as you know, was before 2008, I said that when I was at Goldman Sachs, which is true, I tried to get regulation of derivatives, but there was absolutely no political reality to getting it, and there never was any political reality to getting it. Go ahead.
Okay, so I wasn't quite asking about the derivatives, because you can still oppose derivatives without opposing the CFTC as a regulating body. But regardless of whether or not you want to take necessary responsibility.
No, the way it was structured in '98, I take my word for it. The way it was structured, well, you don't take my word, I don't care, but it was. The way it was structured, it was the risk of it invalidating all pre-existing derivatives contracts, which I say would have created chaos in our system. But go ahead. Is there a larger point to this, or?
Yes,
Good.
I'm trying to get to that.
Well, okay,
given
I'm
your
just trying to
first-hand
find-
experience with money and politics, how would you approach regaining the trust? Because I think, for the most part, the voters are tired of trusting the lawyers who work for Goldman Sachs, or the financial execs who work for Goldman Sachs. Even though you may not have to take responsibility for the 2008 housing market crash, it does seem like the majority of things you advocated for were more like Goldman Sachs initiatives. So how do you regain the trust? Because I'm definitely tired of trusting the Harvard lawyers, and I'm sure Clinton was too.
No, actually, Clinton, I think Clinton trusted us pretty heavily, as a matter of fact. I think that there's a lot of pieces in that, but I think the 2008 crisis was, as I said, there was virtually nobody who foresaw that all of these forces would come together in a perfect storm and cause what it did. And so then what we needed to do as a society, at least in my opinion, was to respond to that with an effective financial reform bill, which in large measure we did. It had a Consumer Protection Bureau, which I thought was a good idea. It had measures on derivatives, which I thought were good, although in my book, if you look at it, you'll find that the measures on derivatives that I was advocating were far stronger than the ones that were in the reform measures after the '08 crisis. And we reacted with a strong stimulus. I don't mean we, but the Obama administration was a strong stimulus. And prior to that, Bush had and Congress had enacted TARP to try to protect or get ourselves back on track. I think the people that you are inclined not to trust are actually not a bad group of people to trust. I don't think they're the problem. I think the problem of money in politics is real, but I don't think it's real in the way that you described it. I think the problem is a real problem. But I think that there are a lot of people, I know, there are a lot of people who are sincerely committed to trying to get this system to do the right things. But the politics of doing it are very difficult. And part of those politics are difficult because of money. But it's not in the financial sector that those problems arise. It arises in a whole bunch of other areas where people's interests are being adversely affected and they engage in effective lobbying to prevent it. But I don't think that's our fundamental, I think it's important, but I don't think it's our fundamental problem. I think our fundamental problem is the things that, well, we'll go with my remarks again, but I think the fundamental problem is that we have gone through a period now of great difficulty. There's tectonic change taking place. Our system has not reacted to it. We've dealt with it in the ways that I think we should, as I did describe actually in my remarks. And I think we've got to come out of that. And I think the way to come out of that is to get some period of time. If we had a leader like Obama, and we had a leader like Clinton, and if we had a Congress that was responsive, I think we would be on a very different track today. I think we have to hope we get back to that point. You know, when Obama was elected, as you all remember, the Senate Majority Leader, Mitch McConnell, said his objective in life was to make sure Obama didn't get reelected. I think a better idea would have been, my objective in life is to work with Obama to get the needs of the country met. And I think we've got to find our way back to some kind of place like that. If we do that, then I think there's a lot we can do and we can get back itself on the right track. I think money in politics is a problem, it's an issue, but I don't think it's anything as remotely as strong as a lot of the other issues I've tried to describe. We can take more questions if you like. No. Look.
Paul, could you like to come up, please? Thank you, Paul, for being
My impression, if I were to come back here and we were to sit around for a couple hours, I think we could have an interesting discussion. I'm not sure either of us would change our minds, but I think it would be interesting.
Mr. Rubin.
Yes, sir.
We are elated and honored to have you with us.
I'm happy to be here.
Thank you so much for that excellent presentation of all the series we have had This was the creme de la creme
Well.
of all the presentations.
I'll bet you Nicholas says that every time.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
You have to check your luggage with it.
Good Lord. I go to a gym twice a week and I can't lift this thing up. I do.
We can mail it for you.
Mail it? You're going to have to send it by rocket or something. Good Lord. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Paul, thank you. I'm going to leave this here, though. Thank you.
so much.
Oh, thank you.
Appreciate
It's a
it.
pleasure to meet you.
Thank you.